prefer to see the Aborigines. And the Indians, too. And the Indians, too. This should be most enlightening.
What makes the red man red?
Teach them all about Red Man.
What made the red man red?
Film and television is hard work. On either side of the camera. Actors can wait years for a dream role, and some writers never get to tell their stories. But what happens on screen reflects and shapes culture. And for Indigenous people in the industry, they see stereotypes, or typecasting.
And the director took mud from underneath a car and put it on her face and said, "You're supposed to be a dirty Indian."
He's afraid to be Comanche.
And red face. Are the solutions coming through Hollywood?
And it's one thing for like the big Hollywood productions not to care. You kind of expect them not to care. It's been 100 years of them not caring.
Teach them all about Red Man. Red Man.
History books, your holidays, Thanksgiving lies and Columbus Day. Tell me what I know more than the teacher. Tell me what I know more than the preacher. Tell me why you think the red man is red, stained with the blood from the land who bled. Tell me why you think the red man is dead, with the fake headdress on your head. Tell me what you know about thousands of nations, displaced and confined to concentration camps called reservations. We died for the birth of your nation.
In old westerns, it wasn't uncommon to see Pretendians, actors in red face. But those days are long gone, aren't they?
I have not seen a non-Indigenous person really pull it off and say, yeah, that's Indigenous, he's got it.
You don't listen so good, do you, Crow Horse?
Val Kilmer plays an FBI agent who is part Sioux. He's just one example of an actor who plays Indian for a role. Some people also play Indian in real life.
And grateful little brother grew up in the family circle.
The most prominent Pretendian was Archibald Delaney. He called himself Grey Owl, and is still considered a cultural treasure by Parks Canada. Aaron Eyes Cody is another man who lived his life as a Native American. He even had cameos in popular sitcoms. But guess what? He was Italian.
Is this ironic? Here we are on Thanksgiving with no food, and who should show up at our doorstep but a tribe of American Indians? I guess the next thing is you offer to share your food with us.
I don't know. The last time we did this, we got into a lot of trouble.
As filmmaker Jeff Barnaby points out, he wasn't the only one.
That's a phenomenon, right? People faking being Native, even outside of like the camera.
Jesse Wente is the director of Canada's new Indigenous Screen Office. The Ojibwe broadcaster and film critic is based in Toronto.
We still see whitewashing for sure in Hollywood, although we're in something of a transformative moment, I would think, here in 2018, in all sorts of ways when it comes to representation and behavior and those sorts of things going on in Hollywood. So I may be more hopeful at the moment that we might see change, but certainly just in recent years, we still see, when it certainly comes to Indigenous peoples on screen, we still see actors that are of, not of Indigenous descent playing those roles.
I'm afraid I have to take you in.
So I think it's an industry that's kind of ripe for imposters, because there's a need for Native stories out there, but there's not a lot of people that can tell them, particularly behind the camera.
Right from the beginning.
Here in Montreal, Barnaby says the industry is vulnerable. He says red face is avoidable.
Some of the things that have gone on in the past few years, even, if the producers and filmmakers just made a few more extra efforts and took a few more steps, I think you wouldn't have gotten some of these whitewashing controversies or casting controversies that you have.
So what has happened in the last few years? Well, in 2013, there was an uproar over Johnny Depp playing Tonto in The Lone Ranger. 2 years ago, a group of Indigenous actors walked off the set of a Netflix production over concerns of stereotypes and red face. Many actors and celebrities have had their Indigenous identities challenged. In 2016, APTN broke a story about Joseph Boyden's claims to a number of Indigenous identities. And just last fall, Adam Beach wrote an open letter about Hollywood whitewashing. He spoke at the University of Saskatchewan about it.
If you look at the history of what I do for a living, the Native people are only the backdrop of movies. There's always somebody coming in to save us, to tell us what to do.
So why not cast Indigenous people in Indigenous roles? Well, it may not be that easy.
You can't. Like say you get a Pretendian, and he steps to you with like, you know, I'm such and such from, you know, this reserve, and you can't really broach that topic. I think there's specific actual rules or SAG rules where you can't sit there and say, you know, what's this and that about your race. So there's no real way to vet anybody coming in pretending to be a Native actor.
Blackfeet and Wasco actor, director, producer, and academic Merton Runningwolf shared a similar sentiment when reached by telephone.
I checked with people in law schools, I checked with people who run businesses, I checked with development offices and different tribal entities and everything else, and I asked them, I said, is it illegal to acknowledge or request proof of tribal enrollment? And they said, no, there's actually federal programs that are set up to actually encourage and incentivize hiring Native Americans who are enrolled members. I'm like, that's what I thought. But the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America have unilaterally decided that they're going to go ahead and support this claim that it's illegal to actually even ask people if they are enrolled members.
APTN reached out to the Screen Actors Guild, who confirmed this. Tribal enrollment is the equivalent to what Canada calls Indian status registration. Wenty reminds us that identity policing is a tool of colonialism.
Because identity is such a complicated, painful thing in our communities, and we know why. The government wanted it to be that way. This is what they wanted us. This was actually a goal of colonialism, right? Was to rob us of our ability to define our own nationhoods and our own nations and our own identities.
The director of Canada's Indigenous Screen Office says Pretendians tend to be weeded out by the communities anyway.
In the end, the communities tend to police themselves and sort of figure this out. And when it comes to true people who are truly being fraudulent, they tend to be called out on it.
It takes time to heal from years of self-abuse.
Tantu Cardinal, veteran stage, television, and film actor, also a member of the Order of Canada, says demanding cards is only one way of verifying indigeneity.
I don't need a card from somebody, from some government, to tell me who I am. It just enrages me, that very idea. And there's other ways of finding out if you're Indigenous or not.
Lisa Meaches, a film and television veteran, says that Indigenous people in the industry tend to know one another. The Ojibwe host and producer of Taken on APTN is also the cultural advisor for the National Screen Institute.
I know everybody, mostly everybody in this industry. There's not too many people that can slip by me. As far as I'm concerned, I hire the real deal.
So what about when Indigenous people do get roles? For Barnaby, it's a non-issue.
When I cast my films, I 1,000% I'm going to cast Native people. There's no two ways about that. It's going to be Native first.
In acting and casting, there's something called a crossover role. Parts for characters who do not have any specific ethnicity or require any deep background. Wenty tells us about his favorite crossover role played by Graham Greene.
For me, I always remember one of my favorite moments in terms of Indigenous representation on screen was actually Graham Greene in Die Hard 3, where he's just the cop. He saves the day, for sure. He rescues the kids while Bruce Willis is off, in Times Square. But it's never brought up that he's Graham Greene, the guy, you know, he's very obviously an Indigenous man, but it has nothing to do with his character.
But many non-Indigenous creators seem to have difficulty when faced with an Indigenous actor playing these roles. Jennifer Podemski is a veteran Canadian actor and producer.
I would go into an audition with all white girls and feel so incredibly insecure and shy. And then I realized, well, how am I ever going to get a role that was written for someone else and change the way people think and see us, and perhaps just get a regular everyday role where being Native isn't, you know, isn't part of the character. I did Degrassi for 9 years, The Next Generation, as the guidance counselor, and there was never, that was never, and it had anything to do with being Native.
Representation isn't just about who plays the roles. It's also about how the stories are told.
You two gotta be the dumbest Indian since Bugs Bunny put on a headdress.
Cartoons too often portrayed stereotypical caricatures. But aren't those days also long gone in the cartoon world?
Crap, they got away.
Better call the boss. Damn, I'm not getting a smoke signal here.
Coming up after the break, we'll head inside a movie theater and meet some young Winnipeg filmmakers.
We've heard from some experienced voices in the film and television industry, but what about those up and coming? What do they think of Indigenous representation on screen? APTN met up with 4 recent graduates of the National Screen Institute. We've asked them to watch some clips with red face and other stereotypical elements, and they will tell us what's happening and what needs to happen in the industry today.
Nota's brother talks like the white man he thinks he is. He's afraid to be Comanche.
The history of red-face, pretendians, and the stereotype of the Hollywood Indian continues today. Some of it's comical, intentionally or not.
It's like they have to hit like the certain points or like certain marks on like what an Indian looks like a headdress, check.
Yeah.
And like the tunic shirt, check. And then war paint, okay, check. There we go. There's your Indian on screen.
Yeah, because if you don't have those things, then you're not an Indian.
Yeah, like
right.
It'll confuse the audience. That's
exactly.
why. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they'll never understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Wait, who are the bad guys? I can't tell.
Some of it, not so much.
My name is Charlene Moore. I am Cree, Soto, and Welsh. My family is from York Factory First Nation, but I was born in Winnipeg. I was raised downtown. I'm a filmmaker. I'm also doing my master's right now in Indigenous governance, and I'm working on a few documentaries. So the Indian fighter, that one really got me with Kirk Douglas. I was just like kind of blown away by it because I hadn't seen it before, and so seeing the way that women were portrayed, just kind of like as objects or like sexual things.
Recently released movies aren't necessarily better.
I think there's still problematic depictions around women in these movies, Indigenous women.
My name is Justina Neepin. I am a Cree First Nations filmmaker.
I'm originally from Thompson, Manitoba. My home band is Fox Lake Cree Nation.
Neepin is with the Aboriginal Filmmakers Collective in Winnipeg. Although she liked Wind River, she wonders why there couldn't be a strong Indigenous female protagonist instead of a white savior.
It's problematic to begin with that the hero of the film is a white guy.
She's a fighter.
Why can't a Native woman be the one to be the hero in a film like that?
Little has changed as we near the end of the second decade of the 21st century.
I think where people really struggle is how to tell an authentically modern, contemporary story or create a realistic version of a Indigenous person today that's not one-dimensional.
Are young filmmakers ready for the challenges ahead of them?
And I think that's kind of a really tricky tightrope you walk as a Native filmmaker, because on one hand you want to make great films because that's what your job is as a filmmaker, but at the same time you're hyper aware of like 100 years of misrepresentation by Hollywood films of Native people.
The 12 tribes of the Comanche will again be as one, greater than the Pawnee, greater than the Apache, fearing no one!
Do they have a role in dispelling a century's worth of myth-making?
Oh, representation is always going to be a problem.
Hi, my name is Ryan Wilson. I am from Peguis, Manitoba. I honestly feel like it's my responsibility to tell Indigenous stories from an Indigenous point of view. That's not really happening right now.
An Indigenous creator behind the camera doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But many of these young filmmakers know they have a role to play, whether directly or indirectly.
I really feel a huge responsibility to do that in a good way and to make films that sort of challenge those stereotypes.
Ollie King is with Indigenous Relations at the City of Winnipeg and is currently writing a web series.
I'm more interested in telling stories of Indigenous people rather than changing the representation, because if that's my goal, then I think I'll be trying doubly hard to try and make it happen, whereas if I just make it happen organically, I think that'll change over time.
Wenty is optimistic, but admits change comes slowly.
I would say sitting here, for example, Black Panther is now already the top grossing or top pre-selling movie in Marvel studio history. We know that there's a whole lot of diverse movies coming out. We saw Thor, directed by Taika Waititi, a Maori guy, be one of the huge hits of the fall. I think there's a lot to be hopeful for, but change in Hollywood is slow, as I think we will see with not just this issue, but even the issues around the Me Too movement. As much as we want to see change in that industry, it can still be glacial, even when forces are so powerful.
What are you doing off the reservation?
Is it possible to change a storytelling style that is centuries old with the style of storytelling which, by comparison, is in its infancy?
The Lord God is your father now.
Late Ojibwe author Richard Wagamese told the story of Saul Indian Horse in a novel that has now been adapted to the big screen.
So what we're seeing now with Native people kind of starting to be able to support themselves enough to be able to break into bourgeois occupations like filmmaking is that translation of that ability to tell a story around a campfire into Native, or not into Native, but into representation of Native people on cinema.
Not only is cinema a new art form by comparison, but it's also a very different way of storytelling.
I think the language of cinema, you're absolutely correct on. It's a Western language. It was developed in the West by Europeans, Americans. It's their way of storytelling.
Something that I've been really interested in lately is our traditional stories and sort of the format that they're told in is a lot different from the Western stories, of the way that we tell stories, in the sense that there's always a protagonist and an antagonist, and there's always a clear moral and a clear bad guy and a clear good guy. You always know who was right and who was wrong, but in our traditional stories, it's not always obvious.
When it comes to representing Indigenous people in Hollywood storytelling, the process follows a simple pattern.
Wind River and Hostiles and The Revenant, all of these are Westerns. To me, that reinforces the creation myth, the manifest destiny creation myth of America, because in that myth, you and I, John, are no longer here, and they get on the train and ride off into the sunset, which is essentially what happens in that film.
Is going Hollywood considered a measurement of success?
No, God, no. I don't see Hollywood as pinnacle of success at all.
Going Hollywood, that's so irritating to me. It's so irritating. You know, I think what I find irritating about that term is it takes us away from why we should be doing this in the first place.
Like, sure, you can be successful in LA, but I feel like that you really need to decide for yourself what is success.
Success to me is the ability to represent your community in a way that makes them proud of you.
Many believe the solutions are in the communities. Lisa Meaches and John Gill are with the National Screen Institute, a Winnipeg-based organization that trains writers, directors, and producers for the film and television industry.
I think what we're going to see is a tsunami of storytellers that is going to come forward within the next couple of years.
So when you go into our programs now, most of the people that come and share their expertise are from the community.
The industry seems to be on the cusp of big change. Creators are getting more support. Content is being distributed on many more platforms than Hollywood's traditional movie theater to home video pipeline.
The internet is going to change the game. It's already changing the game.
Web series, I think that's a huge thing, because people don't always go to the movies now, and we don't even buy cable. Like, I don't have cable.
No one we spoke with thinks the industry is a gravy train.
Here's the thing about filmmaking. It's pretty hard.
Mark, action. If somebody has talent, they could have all the talent in the world. If they don't know how to work hard for it, then they're not going to get anywhere. You have to work hard.
Changing the narrative means controlling the narrative. So maybe there is more than just the productions themselves. But also, it's about the decision makers.
It's vital that Indigenous peoples engage in this medium. And it's vital, if we want true representation, that they engage at all aspects and all levels. In front of, behind of, and in the rooms that decide all of it.